The morning sun poured through the windows of room 203 at Crestwood Middle School, casting long shadows across the freshly polished floors. A young boy sat quietly at his desk, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his new textbook. His deep brown eyes took in every detail of the classroom, from the motivational posters on the walls to the neat rows of empty chairs, which slowly filled with his new classmates. This was Ethan's first day at Crestwood, and everything felt different from his old school. The hallways were wider, the lockers a different shade of blue, and even the air smelled unfamiliar, like a blend of fresh paint and lemon-scented cleaner. He reached up to touch his hair, which had been carefully styled by his grandmother just the night before. "You look handsome," she had said, her warm smile giving him the confidence he needed to begin his new journey. What none of his classmates knew, and what the school staff hadn't been told, was that Ethan's father was actually their new principal, Mr. Callahan. It had been a family decision to keep the connection quiet, at least for the first few weeks. "Give yourself a chance to make friends on your own terms," his father had suggested over breakfast that morning, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror before they left home separately. As students filtered into the classroom, Ethan noticed how they naturally formed groups. Friends who'd known each other since kindergarten shared summer stories and compared class schedules. He pulled out his notebook, the fresh pages waiting for a new start. Just as he opened it, his teacher, Mrs. Cooper, walked into the room. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She began taking attendance, her eyes scanning the room as she called out each name. When she reached Ethan's, there was a slight pause, a barely noticeable shift in her expression that only someone watching closely would catch. Throughout that first morning, Ethan did his best to blend in. He raised his hand when he knew the answers, kept quiet when he didn't, and followed every instruction to the letter. But he couldn't help noticing how Mrs. Cooper's gaze lingered on him a little too long, or how her smile never quite reached her eyes when she spoke to him. During their first writing assignment, Ethan worked diligently on his summer vacation essay. He wrote about a family trip to the zoo, about the animals they had seen, and his dreams of working with wildlife one day. When he handed in his paper, Mrs. Cooper barely glanced at it before placing it at the bottom of the pile. At lunch, a friendly boy named Noah invited Ethan to sit with him and his friends. They talked about video games, their favorite classes, and the upcoming school talent show. For a moment, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Maybe this new school wouldn't be so bad after all. But when they returned to class, he noticed Mrs. Cooper watching him with that same unsettling look. As she handed back the graded papers, Ethan saw the red marks scattered across his paper, like angry scratches. The grade at the top, AB, made his heart sink. He had never gotten anything lower than an A before. Looking around, he saw other students comparing their grades. Most of them had received A's and B's. Noah, who sat next to him, had written a similar length essay about his family's vacation and had received an A. Ethan swallowed hard and tucked his paper into his folder, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. As the afternoon wore on, small incidents began to pile up. Mrs. Cooper interrupted him twice while he was answering questions, something she didn't do with the other students. When he asked to sharpen his pencil, she made him wait until 3 other students had gone first. During art class, she walked past his desk without offering any help, even though she stopped to assist every other student in his row. The final bell couldn't come soon enough. As Ethan packed up his books, he thought about whether to tell his father about his day. He knew his dad would want to know if something was bothering him. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe Mrs. Cooper was just having a bad day. Maybe he was imagining things. Walking down the hallway toward the exit, Ethan passed his father's office. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see Principal Callahan engaged in an animated conversation with another teacher. His dad caught his eye and gave him an encouraging nod. Ethan managed a small smile in return, clutching his backpack a little tighter. That evening, when his mother asked about his first day, Ethan kept his answer simple. It was okay. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something more challenging than he had expected. Still, his grandmother's words echoed in his mind. Stand tall. Be proud of who you are. The next day, Ethan woke up with a sense of resolve. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to prove himself, and he was determined to face it with courage. As weeks passed at Crestwood Middle School, the crisp autumn air brought changes to more than just the leaves outside. Inside room 203, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Ethan had settled into a routine, but Mrs. Cooper's behavior toward him became impossible to ignore, even for his classmates. One morning, while Ethan was solving a math problem at the board, Mrs. Cooper stood behind him, tapping her foot impatiently. "We don't have all day," she said, her voice sharp enough to make several students look up from their notebooks. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he wrote the final answer, which was correct, but Mrs. Cooper merely said, "Sit down," without acknowledging his work. During the same class, when Lily, a girl with blonde pigtails, solved a similar problem more slowly and made two mistakes, Mrs. Cooper's voice turned sweet. "Take your time, dear. Math can be tricky, but you're doing just fine." The contrast was so stark that Noah, Ethan's friend, shot him a concerned look from across the room. At lunch that day, Noah finally spoke up. "My mom says teachers aren't supposed to treat kids differently like that," he said, pushing his apple around his tray. Ethan just shrugged, trying to seem unbothered, but inside, his stomach churned. The situation reached a new level during their history presentations. Each student had to talk about their family heritage. When Ethan proudly shared stories about his grandfather's military service and his family's deep roots in the community, Mrs. Cooper interrupted him halfway through. "That's enough," she cut in, even though he still had 2 minutes left according to the timer. "We need to give others a chance." Yet when the next student spoke for an extra 3 minutes about their summer vacation, completely off topic, Mrs. Cooper beamed and called it wonderfully detailed. Word of Mrs. Cooper's behavior began spreading beyond room 203. Other teachers noticed how she would make comments about Ethan's hair during lunch breaks. "I don't understand why they can't just wear their hair normally," she would say, loud enough for several teachers to hear. Most of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but few spoke up. Mr. Williams, the science teacher, was one of the few who showed concern. He started finding reasons to walk past room 203 during Mrs. Cooper's class. Once, he even stepped in to borrow some chalk right after hearing her raised voice through the door. His presence seemed to calm things down temporarily, but he couldn't always be there. One day, while grading papers, Mrs. Cooper made a show of holding Ethan's essay at arm's length. "The handwriting is absolutely impossible to read," she announced to the class. Even though Ethan's writing was as neat as any other student's, she marked it with a D, despite Noah later saying it was one of the best essays he'd read. The other students began noticing patterns too. How Mrs. Cooper would wrinkle her nose when walking past Ethan's desk, how she would ignore his raised hand during class discussions, and how she blamed him for any noise in the classroom, even when he was quietly reading. Some students began standing up for Ethan in their own small ways. They'd purposely point out when he knew the right answer or ask him for help with their homework where Mrs. Cooper could see. A few even started wearing their hair in different styles in solidarity. None of them fully understood the deeper significance of what was happening, but their support gave Ethan strength. At home, Ethan started having trouble sleeping. He would lie awake, reciting answers to simple questions, terrified of making even the smallest mistake in class. His mother noticed he was quieter at dinner, pushing food around his plate instead of sharing stories about his day like he used to. Some mornings, as Ethan walked to school, he'd see his father's car already in the parking lot. He knew his dad was working hard to improve the school, holding meetings about inclusive education and student welfare. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he still couldn't bring himself to speak up about what was happening in room 203. Mrs. Cooper's recent parent-teacher conferences had raised eyebrows. Parents reported that she seemed to have two entirely different demeanors, warmly praising some students while finding endless faults with others. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone except those who could actually do something about it. The tension was building like a pot about to boil over. Other teachers exchanged worried glances in the hallway. Students whispered among themselves. Even the school secretary had started keeping a small log of incidents she overheard. Everyone could sense that something would have to give, but they didn't know what or when. Through it all, Ethan held on to his grandmother's words about dignity and strength. Each morning, he walked into class with his head high, his homework complete, and his spirit unbroken. But even the strongest spirit can only bend so far before something has to change. And change was coming to room 203 sooner than anyone expected.